We had a sensational finish to the World Rapid Championship, which completed today in Warsaw, Poland. So after 13 rounds of play, we had 4 players all on 9.5 out of 13. So Magnus Carlsen, Jan Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana, all amazing top 10 players. Okay, no real surprises there. But also a 17-year-old sensation, Nodirbek Abdusattorov from Uzbekistan, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so apologies, please let me know. And this kid's only 17, so many strong players up and coming right now from all over the place, and he made it to this top 4 finish. And what that meant is now these 4 had to be separated. So there was a lot of controversy around the tiebreak rule on this one, because what basically happened was the top 2 of these 4 went through to a blitz playoff. And the top 2, it turned out to be Nodirbek, the 17-year-old, and Jan Nepomniachtchi. And they made it through to the tiebreak on the fact that they had played more people in the tournament of a higher rating. So the average rating of the players that they had played was stronger than those that Fabiano and Magnus has played. And Nodirbek actually beat Magnus Carlsen earlier in the tournament, which is a side note. So anyway, it was Jan versus Nodirbek in a 2-game blitz playoff, and that would then decide the World Rapid Champion. In the first game, Jan had white, and the game actually ended peacefully. It was an open Spanish. Nodirbek managed to hold him off. It was a draw. So we went to this second game. Nodirbek had white. I don't want to give the result here so that you can watch through and see what happens. And it was a truly spectacular game. So fasten up. Here we go. So Nodirbek kicks off with this pawn to c4 move, and we had this line of the English, which he actually played against Magnus earlier in the tournament and beat him with it. So here he goes e4, slightly unusual. You'll often see moves like g3 or e3. e4 is a bit unusual. You give the d4 square. Bishop b4 from Jan, that's also what Magnus played. Now we had pawn to d3, pawn to d6, and now pawn to h3. This d4 square is quite critical now. You've played the pawns like this. So h3 prevents this bishop g4 move. Now we had pawn to a5 from Jan. It's a common idea to gain space on the queen side in these structures. Sometimes white will be looking to play b4. Now bishop e2 development. And the bishop nudges back to c5 now. So it's looking pretty dangerously down at the king. And after castles, h6 from Jan. So he's preparing to castle here, I should say, so that's why he plays h6. If he goes castles immediately, then bishop g5 is really annoying because this bishop's come outside the pawn chain. Now if you try h6, bishop drops back, you've got some problems here with the knight hopping in. If you go g5, then this is really thematic. And you're in some trouble here because not only is the knight coming in here, but you've got ideas of developing the queen like this, maybe going f4 later. Not fun for black, especially in a blitz game. So that's why h6, preparing to castle here. And now we had bishop e3 from Nodirbek. Really nice move, actually. So this bishop was looking quite menacing, as mentioned. He's trying to swap it off. Jan obliges. We have the pawn recaptures. So white's got the doubled pawns now, and these could be structurally weak later in the game. But in compensation, the f-file is open, and this d4 square has now been controlled so that the knight can't hop in there. So is f4 as well, we note, in case this one wanted to do this. So castles now from Jan, and queen e1, really standard idea. The queen sits nicely on the dark squares in these structures, and from g3 we can see it's going to be dangerous. Knight e7 now, standard redeployment of the knight, looking to prepare c6 and later d5. We had knight to h4. This square looks great. Let's get it there. Also opens up the rook. And sometimes a sacrifice here, an exchange sacrifice of rook for knight, can be thematic. So watch out for that as black. Now knight g6. So similarly to what Nodirbek did here, Jan doesn't mind these doubled pawns. He opens his rook as well. The king will sit quite nicely here, holding this pawn if needed. It's just a nice position for black. So instead we have knight f5, makes sense. And now c6 from Jan. He looks for counterplay in the centre. If you're getting attacked on a flank, then it's so common to try and counter in the centre. Queen g3 now from Nodirbek, and bishop takes on f5. That knight was starting to look really dangerous. looming over the black position, eyeing these weaknesses in combination with the queen, so Jan chops it off. And rook recaptures makes a lot of sense, because if you take with the pawn, you're blocking that open file for your rook. Makes no sense positionally. So that's why rook recaptures. And now some really nice defensive manoeuvring from Jan. Knight h7, opening up the queen here, we note. And after the rook's double on the f file, now he goes queen h4. Really nice move. And you can't really avoid the queen exchange as white. If you try queen f3, well, now knight g5, and you're basically forced to exchange queens anyway. So that's why after queen h4 here, Nodirbek played king h2. We had this exchange here, and now he goes knight e7. Another great move. If we just run it back, this knight sat here can't actually go anywhere. These squares are controlled, it needs improving, and it's very standard as a positional idea to look to improve your worst pieces. So the knight drops back, it also kicks this dangerous rook, and now after the rook drops back, we have a poor move here from Jan really, so knight g5. Now this knight really needed to be on f6, because from here it controls the g4 square, also h5, and it just keeps tabs on this bishop basically, stops it getting super active. We're not too worried about this exchange sack in this position, because say you do something like rook a to d8 or possibly even king to g7, giving this one, you're okay as black basically, you can get enough counterplay. So that would have been better, knight f6, but knight g5 was played, and now after h4 from Nodirbek, the knight drops back to e6, and now we had bishop g4, and the problem is the knight's just getting kicked around again. It dropped back to c7 here, but just to show you some of the themes going on, say black goes rook a to d8 to play for d5 soon, well now you're actually running into a really nice tactic. If you want to pause the video and look for it, then please do so. And if you're enjoying these videos, then do hit that subscribe button to never miss a future one. So white here plays rook takes on f7. This is not the game continuation, I should say, but this is what could have happened. And after rook recaptures, you're picking up that knight. You have to bring the rook across to defend the f7 rook. And the problem here is white can cash in and win back the exchange at any moment. And in the meantime, you've got really strong breaks like pawn to c5, undermining these pawns because this is really strong. So we didn't get this. This is to show what could have happened if Jan wasn't careful, but he played knight to c7, rescuing that knight. But now we can see why it wasn't good going to g5 and on this journey. So after knight c7, now we had knight a4, great move, eyeing this weak b6 square. Pawn to f6 now from Jan, he solidifies in the centre here. And now we had pawn to d4, another excellent move. And we can see the problem of Nepomniachtchi's position here. White has 3 pawns committed to the 4th rank, taking so much space in the position here as we can see. And these knights are just completely dominated and blocked out. So rook f to d8 now from Jan, and now we had rook to d2. And Jan spent about a minute here almost just thinking, what do I do? So a really long time in a game of blitz chess, and he's got big problems. He's lacking space. These minor pieces are so much better than his own, and white has threats to just double on the d file here, open it at their leisure. You're just bossing black around. So that's why Jan desperately tries for some counterplay here and plays pawn to b5. Not such a bad move in the circumstances because you start to mix things up. So we have this capture here on b5, the knight recaptures now, and rook to c1. Nodirbek comes to that newly opened file and pressures this pawn here, and it's just very uncomfortable for black in terms of where to put the pieces when you've got so little time. Jan brings that rook to the open b file or half open file, knight c3 now, and Nodirbek saying you can simply swap pieces here. So we have king f7 first, pawn h5 clamping, and then we have the piece swap. And even after these exchanges, I still have so much pressure on your position, and here Jan misses a chance. So he plays rook b5, which looks very natural, preparing to double perhaps, putting more pressure here and here, down here as well. But what he misses here is that he should have taken this pawn first. Best is pawn recaptures, but now you don't have problems with white opening the d file at their leisure. Because Jan goes rook to b5 first, Now after the nice retreating move bishop to e2, kicking that rook, after it retreats back to b6, bishop c4 check can't be met comfortably anymore, because pawn to d5, which is what Jan tried, can be met by d takes on e5. And in the last position, this move wouldn't have been available because these pawns had already been exchanged like this. But in this position, it is available. And you can't actually take this bishop. You don't have time because you're losing this rook due to the pin. So a really nice intermezzo from Nodirbek there. So we had this capture here. The pawn recaptured on e5. And now we had this exchange in the center. And e4, great break. And you'd love to go d4 as black here, but you simply can't because of this pin. Really nice calculation from the 17-year-old. So we had this move instead. The king steps out of the pin. The bishop captures here. And Jan's basically forced to actually take this one off. If you try and kind of move around with, I don't know, rook to b4 or something, you're running into big problems on the f-file now with your king, as you can see. So that's why here we had the knight chops the bishop, pawn recaptures, and now look at this dangerous passed pawn. Jan goes for immediate counterplay, so even though he allows this pawn to drop on e5 now, he picks up the h5 pawn, and we have this sequence here. He's trying to get pawns off the board to make his defensive task easier, but this one's now marching forward, as we can see. He throws in a5 here, this was attacked, a4, pardon, and after pawn to a4, we had pawn to d7. Look at this one, tying down the black rook. Really dangerous now for black, especially with the king cut off. King to f7 now, rook to f2 check, and this is the problem. Jan would love to bring that king back to attack the pawn, but he's just getting chopped out of the game now by these rooks. We had rook to e7 now from Nodirbek, rook to d6, hitting the pawn, and look at this for a defensive move. Not only does it hold the pawn here, but it also now hits this g7 pawn. So rook to d3 check, king to f4, rook to b8. So Jan desperately wants to get some counter checks against the king here. But rook takes on g7 check, king to h5, and here Nodirbek missed a mate in two. So he had rook to e5 check, king to h4, and rook to g4 now, checkmate. But he didn't see it. They had seconds on the clock. And after king h5, he played king f5. And now Jan starts checking. So rook takes on b2 first. Rook to g8 now, preparing to queen. But now rook b to d2 covers that queening square. Rook to e1 now. Rook to d5 check. And king to f6. But now these checks just keep coming. Nodirbek's running the king around. But here it comes to g3. Trying to hide away, because now it comes to h2. Rook to d5, covering the checks here against the black king, but now look at this for a deflection tactic. d8 equals queen. That has to be taken, and now rook e5. Nodirbek sees some of the themes right at this last moment. We have king h4 and pawn to g3, a beautiful final move. This has to be captured by the rook now because the king is caught in a mating net. And after, say, rook recaptures, the game is completely lost. If you check, we simply block and you're a rook up. So what a sensational win by the 17-year-old from Uzbekistan. Huge congratulations to him. And if you've enjoyed this video, do let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button and consider subscribing here to never miss a future video. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.